Winter arrived early that year, bringing a biting cold that seeped through the cracks in the oldest houses. Detroit, where the cracked concrete looked as weary as the people hurrying along the sidewalks. Christmas lights hung from the lampposts, but many didn't work. They blinked erratically, as if even they hesitated to celebrate. Miguel had 12 years, and he knew that cold well. Not just the kind that burned his fingers and numbed his feet inside worn-out sneakers, but the other kind, the cold of arriving home and not finding enough food. He crossed the neighborhood pushing a rusty shopping cart, found months before behind an abandoned warehouse. Inside it, there were no toys or presents. There were donated bread, crushed cans, some vegetables, and 2 coolers borrowed from the local church. Miguel didn't complain, not because he was too strong to feel, but because he had learned early on that complaining didn't warm anyone's stomach. On the other side of town, in an old building of darkened bricks, lived Harold Whitman, 78 years old, former accountant, former husband, former respected man. Now, just another number on a list of overdue retirements. The building's elevator hadn't worked for months, and Harold rarely left his 4th-floor apartment. Not out of laziness, but because each step was a cruel reminder that his body no longer obeyed him as it once did. That morning, December 24th, Harold sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of weak coffee. The stale bread beside him remained untouched. Eating alone had lost its meaning long ago. Miguel stopped in front of the building at exactly noon. The cart creaked as it was pulled along the uneven sidewalk. He adjusted his hat, took a deep breath, and entered the lobby. The smell of mold mixed with cheap cleaning products didn't bother him. He had been there before. They can eat. That's it, she thought, mentally repeating the phrase that had become her secret impulse. It wasn't an official project. There was no authorization from the city hall, nor support from large institutions. It had all started 2 weeks earlier, when Miguel noticed some elderly people sitting on park benches, always the same ones, always silent. He overheard a fragmented conversation about overdue bills and skipped meals. That night, he returned home with the silent decision to do something, anything. He knocked on the first door in the hallway. 3 short, firm knocks. He waited. The door opened just enough to reveal a wary face, furrowed with deep wrinkles. "It's food," Miguel said quickly before the door closed. "Christmas. I brought it." There was a silence that was too long for a simple answer. Then the door opened a little wider. A trembling hand pointed to the cart. "How much does it cost?" Miguel shook his head. "Nothing. Just eating." The door closed again, but this time it wasn't rejection. Minutes later, it opened again, allowing Miguel to put a bag on the floor. Harold watched everything from inside the apartment. He had heard knocks on other doors, heard low voices, felt something different moving through the hallway, a kind of movement that hadn't come from the building in years. When the knocks reached his door, he didn't get up immediately. He stood there, motionless, as if the simple act of opening it was too great a risk. The beat came again. Harold stood up, leaning on the table, and opened the door. Miguel didn't smile. Not because he was sad, but because he had learned that smiling could seem condescending. He simply pointed to the cart. "I brought food, if you want some." Harold looked at the boy. He noticed the thin coat, the sleeves that were too short, the hands reddened by the cold. Then he looked at the stroller. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. "Yes, sir. And your parents allow this?" Miguel hesitated for a second. "My mother is working today." Harold understood more than what had been said. He opened the door completely, giving Miguel just enough room to drop off his bag. As the boy turned to leave, Harold did something he hadn't done in months. He spoke quickly, before the opportunity slipped away. "Wait." Miguel stopped. "Have you eaten today?" The question wasn't accusatory, it was direct, almost technical. Miguel answered with the same objectivity. "I'll eat later." Harold nodded, as if accepting a poorly solved equation, and closed the door slowly. Throughout the afternoon, Miguel went up and down stairs, pushed the cart through narrow corridors, knocked on doors that had never been opened to strangers. Some didn't open, others did. At each one, he left more than food. He left movement, presence, something that broke the chronic immobility of that forgotten building. As the sun began to set, the cart was almost empty. Miguel sat on the last step of the outside staircase, exhausted. The cold seemed more intense now, or perhaps it was just fatigue finally taking its toll. He didn't notice when Harold came out of the building, leaning on an old cane. "Hey, kid." Miguel looked up. Harold held out a small bag. "Hot soup. I made too much." Miguel hesitated for only a moment before accepting. In that simple moment, neither of them knew that that gesture, small, almost invisible to the rest of the city, was about to change destinations, to expose old wounds and challenge structures far larger than an old building or a boy with a rusty toy car. But something had already changed. The silence in the neighborhood that night wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation. The morning after Christmas, the brick building looked different, although nothing structural had changed. The cracks were still there, the elevator remained out of service, and the cold wind still blew through the poorly sealed corridors. Still, there were subtle signs of transformation. Doors that had previously remained closed now opened for a few seconds longer. Voices emerged where there had once been only silence, and the persistent smell of reheated food mingled with the old mold. Miguel returned to the building on the 26th, not with a full shopping cart, but with a light backpack and a crumpled notebook. He wrote everything down: names, apartment numbers, dietary restrictions, who needed medical help, who simply needed to talk. He didn't do this out of excessive organization. He did it because he had learned early on that when resources are scarce, mistakes are costly. The neighborhood surrounding the building reflected a Detroit forgotten by promises of economic recovery. Old abandoned factories lined the streets, their broken windows resembling empty eyes. Many residents had grown old there, hoping the city would remember them again. Few had family nearby, some no contact for years. I didn't live in apartment 3B. Lena Price, 72 years old, former nurse. Her frail body hid a still sharp mind, but her pension barely covered her medication. In 2A, Frank Delaney, a Gulf War veteran, was dealing with constant pain and sleepless nights. In 4C, Ruth Kaplan, the widow, had lost the habit of cooking after her husband died. Eating had become a mechanical act, devoid of pleasure. Miguel didn't ask too many questions. He observed. He had learned to identify who needed more food, who needed silence, and who needed, above all, someone to listen without rushing. He didn't talk about himself. When asked, he answered with short phrases, diverting the focus. Harold began to observe him with increasing attention. There was something about that boy that didn't fit the common image of occasional charity. Miguel didn't just show up to deliver something and leave. He came back. He remembered names. He noticed absences. When Ruth didn't open the door one day, Miguel returned at night to check. He found her collapsed on the sofa, too weak to get up. He called for help quietly. Gradually, Harold began to go down more often. First, only to the second floor, then to the lobby. Each descent was slow, painful, but there was a purpose that made the effort bearable. He had begun to help Miguel in an almost imperceptible way. Correcting accounts, helping to organize lists, explaining how to ask for donations from local markets, without seeming like a beggar. Harold didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone trying to make up for years of indifference. For decades, he had passed by people like Miguel without seeing anything beyond numbers and probabilities. Now, each step he climbed seemed like a belated attempt at reconciliation. Miguel's mother, Rosa, she worked double shifts at an industrial laundry. She knew what her son was doing, but she didn't have the strength to stop him. She trusted him because she had no other choice. At night, when Miguel came home, they shared what was left over. They didn't talk much about the building. Rosa understood that some things needed to exist without excessive explanation. The social context surrounding them didn't help. Assistance programs had been cut, and many elderly people fell into bureaucratic loopholes. They earned too much to receive help, but too little to survive with dignity. Miguel didn't understand the technical terms, but he understood the outcome, and he reacted in the only way he knew: direct action. As the days passed, other residents began to help out. Eleanor started preparing small extra portions whenever she could get ingredients. Frank helped carry bags. Ruth, after recovering, resumed the habit of cooking, not out of hunger but out of necessity. The building, once a collection of isolated individuals, began to behave like a slow yet living organism. Miguel noticed the changes, but he didn't let himself get carried away by enthusiasm. He knew that fragile structures break easily. Still, he noted something new in his notebook. Meeting, maybe. Harold noticed the boy's attentive gaze and understood that this was about more than just meals. There was a silent reorganization of lives that had been pushed to the margins, and that, he knew, rarely went unnoticed for long. Outside, the city continued indifferently. Traffic flowed, shop windows changed their decorations, and winter advanced. But inside that forgotten building, small decisions were beginning to generate consequences that no one there could yet measure. Something was being built, not with speeches or promises, but with repetition, effort, and constant presence. And structures like that, sooner or later, attract attention. The first sign that something was about to change didn't come from inside the building, but from the street. A notice was posted on the front door on a grey January morning: scheduled inspection, municipal administration. The plain piece of paper, held together with transparent tape, went unnoticed by many, but not by Harold. He stood before the notice longer than necessary, reading each word as if searching for something hidden among the letters. Miguel arrived shortly after, pushing the cart, now more organized, with labeled boxes and reused bags. Harold called the boy aside and pointed to the paper. "That's not common," he said quietly. "They only show up when someone complains or when they want to shut something down." Miguel frowned. He didn't ask who would complain. They both knew the implicit answer. Informal initiatives were never viewed favorably when they arose outside of institutional control. Even so, Miguel continued. That week the cold worsened, and some elderly residents spent days without leaving their apartments. The gas supply failed in 2 units, and hot food became even more necessary. Miguel adapted the routine, changing schedules, avoiding crowds in the hallway, and distributing everything quickly and quietly. But the conflict grew in other ways. An employee from the building's management company showed up unannounced, accompanied by a man in a dark suit. They walked around the hallways, jotting things down on clipboards, observing the activity, and asking vague questions. One of them looked at Miguel's stroller with excessive interest. "Is this yours?" he asked. Miguel responded simply with a nod. "Do you have permission to distribute food here?" Miguel didn't answer. Harold intervened before the silence could be interpreted as guilt. "It's mutual aid among residents," he said. "Nothing commercial." The man wrote something down and moved on, but the warning had been given. In the following days, some residents grew apprehensive. Eleanor suggested reducing deliveries. Frank mentioned that the building had been close to being condemned before. Ruth began hoarding food, fearing that everything would suddenly shut down. Miguel felt the weight of it. For the first time, his actions were beginning to generate fear along with relief. He adjusted the plan: less volume, more discretion. Still, the internal conflict grew, not as long reflection, but as quick decisions made under pressure. Then came the second blow. An official letter arrived for Harold, aggravated default notice. The overdue rent had been reassessed, and now there was a real risk of eviction. Harold immediately understood the cruel logic. Buildings with unstable residents were easier to empty and sell. He didn't tell Miguel that same day. He tried to resolve it himself, reviewing accounts, searching for old documents. But each call ended in hold or automated responses. The system wasn't designed to listen. Miguel noticed the change in Harold's behavior, less presence, more silence. When he finally learned about the letter, he reacted with immediate action. He went back to his notebook, scribbled down numbers, names, possibilities. He spoke with Eleanor, with Frank, with Ruth. For the first time, he spoke to them all together. It wasn't a formal meeting. It was an impromptu encounter in the lobby, standing with coats buttoned and voices hushed. Miguel explained the risk in few words. He didn't ask for anything directly. He simply showed what would happen if the building lost Harold, and consequently, the fragile balance they had built. The reactions were varied. Some remained silent, others looked away, but no one left. That night, Miguel came home later than usual. Rosa noticed his different kind of tiredness, not physical, but the kind that comes from a sense of responsibility. She didn't ask. She simply served dinner. In the building, Harold sat at the table with the open letter in front of him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the face of a problem. This frightened him almost as much as it relieved him. The inspection was scheduled for the following week. The risk of eviction was real, and the initiative that had begun as a simple food distribution now threatened to expose much larger flaws, bureaucratic, human, and moral. The conflict was no longer just about hunger. It was about who had the right to remain. The week leading up to the inspection had transformed the building into a space of contained tension. There was no open panic, just constant vigilance, doors closing too quickly, conversations interrupted by footsteps echoing in the hallway. Miguel realized that to keep the essentials running, he needed to deal with more than just food. The first subplot emerged from Eleanor. As a former nurse, she knew the signs of physical deterioration that many residents ignored out of pride or lack of access. She began discreetly visiting apartments, checking blood pressure, adjusting medication schedules, and advising on minor changes. Miguel helped by bringing basic supplies. This reduced emergencies, but also exposed something bigger. Several residents were technically eligible to receive home medical assistance, but had never been registered. Harold tackled this task with precision. He spent hours on the phone, filling out forms, correcting administrative errors that had accumulated over the years. Each correct fix prevented a possible incompetence removal, a common practice when the system failed to provide real support. Another complication arose with Frank. The veteran began experiencing more frequent seizures. The sound of footsteps in the hallway at night made him overly alert. Miguel realized he needed to adapt his schedule and routes to avoid triggering reactions. Frank, in turn, began accompanying Miguel on nighttime deliveries, not out of physical necessity, but for surveillance. His presence discouraged curious onlookers and employees who lingered unannounced. Ruth faced a different kind of conflict. Cooking again had awakened memories she had buried. Some days she would prepare too much food and then withdraw, shutting herself away in her apartment. Miguel learned not to force it. He would simply leave an extra bag by the door. Gradually Ruth reappeared, offering help in a more controlled manner. Meanwhile, outside, the building's administrator was increasing the pressure. A new notice appeared. Food safety review. He didn't mention names, but he made it clear that any unauthorized distribution could result in collective penalties. The message wasn't legal, it was strategic. It created division. Some residents began to question Miguel. Not out of ingratitude, but out of fear. One suggested they stop everything until the inspection was over. Another commented that the building had survived without help before. Miguel listened, mentally noted it down, and continued. Did you know that structures under pressure reveal cracks? The most delicate subplot, however, came from Miguel's own home. Rosa received a notice of reduced shifts. The laundry had lost its contract, and the impact was immediate. Fewer hours meant less food, less room for error. Miguel didn't tell anyone in the building. He simply adjusted his own meals even further. This silent tension began to shape his decisions. He started seeking donations outside the usual channels, approaching smaller markets, bakeries at the end of the day, restaurants that closed early. It didn't always work. Sometimes he would come back with little, sometimes with nothing. Nevertheless, the building remained operational. Not due to stability, but due to constant adaptation. On the eve of the inspection, Harold gathered some residents in his apartment. Nothing formal, just a straightforward conversation about what could happen. He didn't promise results, he simply explained the risks and options. For the first time, he spoke openly about mass evictions, something everyone knew about but avoided naming. Miguel listened in silence. He didn't have legal solutions. He had presence, organization, and persistence. By then, he understood that this too was a form of resistance. When everyone had left, Harold was alone for a moment. He looked at the forgotten notebook on the table, Miguel's. He flipped through a few pages, names, numbers, short observations. Nothing sentimental, just data that together told a story of collective survival. The inspection the following day wouldn't decide everything, but I would define who was willing to back down. The day of the inspection dawned, with a light snow covering the neighborhood, transforming Detroit into a silent canvas of white and gray. The building seemed smaller, its imperfections accentuated by the contrast between the ice and the old brick. Miguel pushed the cart, now with less food, but more organized, with discreet packaging and handmade labels. Each delivery that morning carried the weight of uncertainty. The municipal administration employee arrived at 9 o'clock, accompanied by a health inspector. They both entered quietly, observing the corridors and doors. It seemed to be just another bureaucratic ritual, but Miguel sensed that this was the moment when everything could change, or end abruptly. As the inspector walked down the hallway, someone began to cough. Frank, hiding behind a half-open door, seemed frail, but firm enough not to run away. Eleanor adjusted the temperature of a heater, trying not to attract attention. Ruth peered from the kitchen. Every movement in the building was calculated, almost choreographed. Miguel entered apartment 1C, where a lady named lived, Marge, known for her sharp tongue and suspicious eyes. She handed over the bag, and as she was leaving, she heard a strange noise in the hallway, hurried footsteps and raised voices. Harold appeared, holding documents that should never have left his desk. "Wait," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't just an inspection. It's a threat of mass eviction if there are any irregularities." The inspector raised an eyebrow, but Harold was undeterred. He presented old records, letters, and revised accounts, proving that the residents had done everything correctly. Tension rose when one of the administration officials suggested that Miguel's unauthorized donations could be interpreted as a violation of regulations. Then came the unexpected revelation. While everyone awaited the verdict, the inspector consulted a digital system, typing rapidly. His eyes widened when he found an urgent notification. It wasn't about Miguel or the building, but about a third-party company that managed several buildings in the city. Massive tax fraud. The investigation was already underway, and those buildings were about to be audited. Harold's building was listed, but Miguel and the residents, with their quiet initiative, had documented more information than any official system could have captured. The effect was immediate. The inspector interrupted the administrative employee, arguing about who had provided the data, while Harold and Miguel remained silent, exchanging a look of mutual understanding. The boys' small action, which consisted only of delivering food and organizing information, was now becoming indirect proof of larger irregularities. In the hallway, the residents watched in silence. None of them had anticipated that something so simple, presence, attention, and care, could generate such a broad and unexpected consequence. For the first time, Miguel felt the real impact of his actions. It wasn't just about food, cold, or loneliness. It was about to change the course of decisions that no one believed were possible to change. The boy who used to cross icy streets was now unwittingly becoming a catalyst for invisible justice. And as the snow continued to fall, Harold discreetly squeezed Miguel's shoulder without saying a word. The message was clear. The fate of the building, its residents, and his own story had changed forever. All because of a seemingly small but courageous initiative. The impact of the turning point was immediate and silent. The building manager backed down, realizing the audit couldn't be ignored. No eviction proceedings were initiated, and the pressure on Harold eased almost instantly. The residents, who had remained tense for the past few days, felt a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if the routine they were accustomed to had been suddenly disrupted by an invisible but decisive force. Miguel continued his deliveries, but now with a new understanding. Each action had repercussions that went beyond the immediate. Eleanor began recording not only medical data, but also brief accounts of the residents' habits, needs, and interactions. These records would serve as a kind of safety net for any future situation. Frank became more active, taking on small surveillance tasks and helping with logistics. Even Ruth, who had previously withdrawn into herself with trauma, began offering quick cooking classes, teaching small groups how to cook simple and nutritious meals. Harold, in turn, adopted a firmer and more strategic stance. He began mediating conflicts between residents, establishing maintenance routines, organizing small meetings to discuss improvements, and creating a sense of community that had previously seemed impossible. He realized that each of the boys' actions not only saved lives, but also created a network of resilience capable of protecting the building from future threats. The external effect was also felt. Small neighborhood markets and bakeries, which previously only provided sporadic donations, began to collaborate consistently. What was once improvisation became a coordinated yet discreet operation to ensure everyone had enough food. The neighborhood, until then indifferent, began to view the building and its residents with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Among the residents, new dynamics emerged. Bonds that were once superficial were now strengthened. Small acts of kindness multiplied, and the initial fear of surveillance transformed into a collective sense of protection. The tension did not disappear completely, but it began to be managed with strategy and solidarity. Miguel, however, did not lose focus. He understood that, despite recent achievements, the outside world could still interfere. The lesson was clear. Precise action and vigilance were as important as generosity and compassion. Each delivery, each interaction, each entry in his notebook contributed to consolidating an invisible network of safety, learning, and social transformation. At the end of the day, Miguel sat on the last step of the outside staircase, looking at the building that was beginning to pulsate with life. Harold passed by him, holding a cup of hot coffee, and said, "Do you realize what you've done here? It's not just about the food. It's about organization, care, presence. That changes everything." Miguel looked at him without saying a word. A small smile escaped him, discreet but full of meaning. He knew that the real impact was only beginning, and that the building, its residents, and he himself were now intertwined in something greater than they could have imagined. The city remained indifferent, but inside that building, each gesture resonated like a firm note in a symphony of resilience, transforming small actions into profound and lasting consequences. The weeks following the inspection transformed the building into a microcosm of change and evolution. Miguel, now more confident in his routine, realized he needed to expand not only food deliveries, but also the way he connected with the residents. He began organizing small support groups, helping seniors exchange recipes, health information, and household economy tips. Each meeting was brief, discreet, but full of purpose, to create collective resilience without depending on external authorities. Harold evolved along with them. The fear of losing the building had transformed into a determination to strengthen the community. He began teaching the residents how to keep track of their bills, plan small purchases efficiently, and coordinate simple maintenance tasks among themselves. His transformation was not only physical, but also mental. Once resigned, he now assumed the responsibility of a silent leader, inspiring confidence in those who had previously doubted even themselves. Eleanor, who previously dealt with medical problems alone, now coordinated regular visits to the apartments, teaching preventative habits and guiding each resident according to their needs. Frank learned to cope with his crises, using his military experience to create discreet protection routines. Ruth found purpose in her return to the kitchen. Her simple recipes became part of small community gatherings, transforming meals into moments of connection. Miguel faced his own growth. Every decision needed to be quick and precise, balancing empathy and strategy. He understood that his role was not just to feed the people, but to create invisible structures of support and solidarity. He began delegating small tasks to more capable residents, training them to act in a coordinated way. The boy who once pulled a food cart alone now guided a resilient network, learning the importance of trust and collaboration. Furthermore, Miguel began to notice small internal changes in the residents. Eleanor smiled more often, Ruth showed enthusiasm for teaching, Frank took on small responsibilities without anyone needing to insist. Harold moved confidently through the hallways, inspiring a sense of stability and security. Each improvement was the result of concrete actions, not speeches or theories. The building's routine wasn't without its challenges, but the community had developed coping mechanisms. Unexpected problems continued to arise. Power outages, extremely cold days, minor illnesses, but all the residents now involved acted in a coordinated manner. Each challenge overcome consolidated trust and strengthened the network that Miguel and Harold had started. In silence, Miguel understood that his growth lay not only in leadership, but in learning to measure consequences, understand limits, and create collective solutions. His courage, previously limited to delivering food, had transformed into the ability to positively influence lives around us, ensuring that every gesture of care multiplied. The building, once a symbol of abandonment and isolation, now breathed hope. Every corridor, every door, every timid laugh or conversation interrupted by the laughter of the elderly was proof that change was possible. Miguel didn't need grand speeches or formal power. His strength lay in continuous action, an attentive gaze, and the ability to transform small gestures into lasting results. With the building now functioning almost like a small, self-sufficient community, Miguel realized that the real test was yet to come. The inspection had only been the first challenge, and new external pressures were looming. Rumors of real estate speculation, neighbors interested in acquiring the building for low prices, and possible changes in social welfare policies. Each of these factors represented a direct threat to the fragile balance that had been achieved. Miguel began planning a series of preventative actions. He distributed tasks among the most capable residents. Ruth started preparing extra meals for emergencies, Frank monitored entrances and exits during critical times, and Eleanor kept detailed health records. Harold, in turn, took on the responsibility of creating a database of documents, contracts, payment records, and proof of assistance, ready for any future audit. Meanwhile, the boy increased neighborhood engagement. He discreetly spoke with local merchants, small business owners, and bakeries that previously only donated sporadically, assuring them that, in case of need, there would be a network ready to provide supplies. Each delivery now was not only about food, but also strategic, strengthening ties and creating invisible alliances. Tension increased daily. The presence of unknown people lurking around the building was noticed by the residents. Small arguments arose about trust and exposure. Miguel had to intervene, teaching the residents to observe signs, to ask questions discreetly, and to record relevant information. These were not acts of paranoia. They were protective measures necessary to keep the community intact. Meanwhile, Harold began restructuring the building's common areas, even in simple ways. Small repairs, cleaning, and reorganizations, previously neglected, were prioritized. Each cleaned hallway, each replaced light bulb, each functioning heater created a tangible sense of security. Miguel noticed that these simple actions, carried out with discipline, not only boosted morale, but also prepared the building to face any inspection or external threat. The intense cold persisted, and food deliveries needed to be adjusted daily. Miguel developed a rotating system of schedules and routes, ensuring that no one went without food, without overburdening any resident. Strategic planning blended into daily routine, making every gesture essential and every decision critical. As the community grew stronger internally, a silent tension arose. Something bigger was about to happen. Miguel sensed that the external attention wouldn't be merely bureaucratic. There was interest, observation, and possibly attempts at destabilization. Every action, every delivery, every record now carried risk, but it also carried opportunity. The building, the community, and Miguel were ready for the final test. Every gesture of the recent past had transformed into silent preparation for a climax that would demand courage, speed, and unity. The feeling was clear. The decisive moment was approaching, and no one could face it alone. The day of the final test arrived with an almost palpable tension. A group of representatives from a real estate company appeared at the building's door, accompanied by city inspectors. They claimed to be interested in renovating and reselling the building, justifying the action as necessary for urban revitalization. For the residents, it meant eviction, loss of autonomy, and the destruction of months of silent reconstruction. Miguel, Harold, and the residents were ready. Every gesture from the recent past, the deliveries, the organization, the medical and financial records, converged in that moment. The boy observed the hallway, the neighbors' glances, every detail that could be used to protect his home. Harold, firm, held the complete documentation that could challenge any immediate decision. The meeting began in the lobby. The company representatives started talking about renovation plans, deadlines, and costs. The words fell heavily, like stones, but no one backed down. Miguel remained silent, mentally noting each point and each flaw in the argument that could be exploited. Eleanor and Ruth were attentive, ready to add medical and social information about the residents. Frank, with a steady gaze, remained near the doors, watching for any suspicious movement. The decisive moment came when the City Hall announced that the company had not completed the necessary documentation to legitimize the action. At the same time, Harold presented detailed records of payments, donations, and services provided, showing that the residents were not negligent, but rather part of an organized and responsible community. The evidence was clear, complete, and unexpected for everyone present. Miguel then stepped forward. Without saying too much, he pointed to the record documentation, explaining how each food delivery and each medical assistance had been carefully organized to ensure that the residents remained safe and self-sufficient. His calm, firm, and confident demeanor surprised the representatives. He wasn't just a boy, he was the link that held an entire community together. The company representative tried to argue, but the strength of the organization and the documentation presented left no room for maneuver. Each attempt at pressure was neutralized by concrete evidence, Miguel's detailed observation, and the silent coordination of Harold and the residents. The action that seemed poised to destroy the building crumbled in the face of irrefutable evidence and collective strength. The tension slowly dissipated. The city government decided to postpone any action, demanding that additional studies be carried out. The company, realizing it could not manipulate the situation, backed down. The building remained standing, and the residents, emboldened, breathed a sigh of relief. The climax not only saved the building, but transformed everyone's perception of power and influence. Miguel, the boy who only delivered food, had become a catalyst for silent justice. Harold finally realized that it wasn't just about surviving, but about turning the impossible into reality through action, strategy, and collective courage. As the snow continued to fall outside, the residents exchanged glances, sharing a silent feeling. The victory was not just about documents or inspections, but about the very ability to change destinies through small yet powerful, consistent actions. With the external threat contained, the building breathed a quiet peace, yet one laden with meaning. Each resident realized that the community they had built depended not only on authorities or external gestures, it depended on attention, care, and coordinated action. Miguel, Harold, Eleanor, Frank, and Ruth became living symbols of resilience and collaboration. Daily life resumed its rhythm, but in a transformed way. Miguel continued his deliveries and records, but now with the full support of the residents. Harold assumed administrative leadership of the building, guiding everyone with discipline and care. Eleanor organized preventative health sessions. Frank took care of security, and Ruth maintained the small culinary gatherings that had become a tradition. Each action, however simple, reinforced the safety net and strengthened the bonds between neighbors. The emotional impact was also visible. Residents who previously isolated themselves now talked, shared stories, and helped each other. Small acts, such as helping someone carry groceries or preparing an extra meal, became normal, creating an environment of trust and solidarity. The change was not only physical but profoundly human. The building that once symbolized abandonment now represented hope and the capacity for transformation. The final surprise, which had been unfolding since the beginning of Miguel's intervention, revealed itself in the form of new resources and opportunities. Some local merchants offered regular support. Neighbors from outside the area began to notice the impact of the community work, creating a steady stream of small contributions. And quietly, the city began to remember that building and its collective strength. Miguel, sitting on the step of the outside staircase, observed the daily activity. He understood that he didn't need recognition or applause. Every gesture he made had transformed lives, small changes that multiplied into real and lasting impact. He had learned that courage, organization, and compassion could alter destinies, even in forgotten and vulnerable places. The building remained standing, intact, protected not only by documents but by collective determination and the power of consistent actions. And above all, Miguel knew that true triumph lay not only in overcoming obstacles, but in creating a community capable to sustain itself and flourish on its own. Christmas, which had begun with cold and scarcity, ended with human warmth, solidarity, and hope. A cycle transformed by the silent initiative of a boy who never underestimated the power of small actions. Months later, the building remained safe and organized. Miguel still made his deliveries, but now with the help of all the residents. The spirit of collaboration remained alive, and small gestures multiplied naturally. Harold walked the hallways with renewed confidence. Eleanor kept her health records always up to date, and Ruth shared her prescriptions with constant smiles. What began as a simple act of kindness transformed an entire community, showing that even the smallest gestures can have a lasting impact. The building was no longer just a shelter, it was a symbol of hope and unity. If this story touched you, share it with friends and family to spread the message of solidarity and courage. Every gesture of help, no matter how small it may seem, can transform lives and entire communities. Subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories like Miguel's and discover how simple actions can generate real change. Join us to make a difference, because together we can build a more humane and connected world.